In the spring of 1942, the German High Command framed a new campaign around a material constraint rather than a single battlefield objective: liquid fuel. The winter of 1941 to 1942 left Army Group Center stalled before Moscow, and Army Group South depleted on the Ukrainian steppe. Panzer divisions reported hundreds of non-operational vehicles from mechanical wear and inadequate fuel reserves. Luftwaffe bomber groups rationed sorties to conserve aviation gasoline. German crude output inside Europe was insufficient, and the coalition relied on Romanian fields around Ploiesti and on synthetic plants that converted coal into motor spirit. Imports from Romania supplied a majority share of German petroleum needs in 1941 to 1942, but deliveries were finite and vulnerable to transport bottlenecks and air attack. The strategic estimate concluded that securing Soviet oil installations in the northern Caucasus, Maikop and Grozny as immediate targets, Baku as a longer-term goal, was the only path toward increasing available tonnage while simultaneously denying it to the Red Army. Soviet energy geography made the Caucasus decisive in procurement terms. In 1940, Soviet crude production was concentrated in the Transcaucasian and North Caucasian districts, with Baku contributing the largest share, and Grozny and Maikop adding smaller but still important volumes. After the Axis invasion in June 1941, Moscow prioritized evacuating refinery equipment, drilling rigs, and skilled labor from threatened zones, and reorganizing rail flows to keep the front supplied with fuel, lubricants, and aviation gasoline. The State Defense Committee directed the People's Commissariat of the oil industry to disperse capacity east of the Volga and deepen pipelines and storage sites against air attack. Even with these measures, the dependency of Soviet mechanized formations on Caucasian output remained significant, and the approach routes to the mountains, the Don Basin, the Lower Kuban, and the Terek line became operationally important corridors in Stavka planning. On April 5, 1942, Adolf Hitler issued Directive Number 41, framing the summer operation commonly known as Case Blue. The directive set a hierarchy: destroy Soviet forces in the south, seize the Don crossing zones, and advance into the Caucasus to capture oil centers. The structure of Army Group South reflected these aims. By June, its core mobile elements included 1st Panzer Army and 4th Panzer Army, supported by 6th Army and 17th Army, with Axis-allied contingents from Romania, Italy, and Hungary deployed along the broader frontage. The operational design required high rates of advance across wide river obstacles and along rail lines that had to be converted from Soviet broad gauge to German standard gauge under fire. German railway troops, construction battalions, and the Transport Directorate were tasked to rebuild bridges over the Don and Manich and to extend logistic spurs toward Rostov-on-Don, Armavir, and Krasnodar. Calculations for motor transport assumed daily lift capacities that could be sustained only if fuel columns kept pace and if maintenance teams reduced vehicle losses from dust, heat, and long march distances. Soviet preconditions were shaped by the attrition of 1941 and the rebuilding effort of early 1942. Stavka reconstituted mechanized corps with reduced authorized strengths and emphasized layered defense along rivers, urban nodes, and rail junctions. The North Caucasus Front and the Transcaucasus Front coordinated with the Black Sea Fleet and the NKPS railway network to prepare for a potential enemy descent toward Maikop and Grozny. Defensive works multiplied on the lower Don and the Terek, while engineering units surveyed demolition plans for bridges, oil depots, and pumping stations. The political leadership balanced two imperatives: keep industry operating to supply the front and prepare to deny industrial assets to the attacker through evacuation or destruction. Civil authorities in Krasnodar Krai and the Grozny district drew up evacuation lists for refinery staff and prioritized rail cars for equipment, chemicals, and toolkits essential to restart production further east if necessary. Both coalitions approached the campaign with intelligence estimates that carried risk. German assessments of Soviet reserves in the southern theater drew on prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, and signals intelligence, and tended to infer that Red Army morale and materiel in the south were weaker than in the Moscow sector. Soviet estimates noted German force concentrations west of the Donets and identified mobile groupings, but did not initially agree on the main axis of effort, weighing a renewed drive toward the capital against a southern operation. The result was a defensive posture that had to protect multiple avenues while reserving mobile forces for counterblows, a demanding task given rail congestion and the need to cover the long front from Voronezh to the Sea of Azov. Terrain and distance set constraints before the first march order. From the Don Bend to Maikop, the overland distance exceeded 300 kilometers along roads and rails that crossed steppe river systems and, south of the Kuban, entered broken ground of foothills and forest. Grozny lay farther east behind the Terek, with approaches narrowing between mountain spurs and the Caspian lowlands. The Caucasus Range itself imposed elevation, gradient, and weather that reduced vehicle reliability and limited the massing of armor. German logistics planners mapped consumption rates for panzer and motorized infantry divisions that rose sharply with terrain resistance and detours around damaged bridges, while Luftwaffe fuel burns increased with summer heat and dusty forward strips. Soviet planners counted on those frictions, expecting that extended German supply lines over single-track railways and vulnerable pontoon crossings would slow operational tempo and create windows for counterattack. Civilian environments along the intended corridors added further variables. The lower Don and Kuban regions contained agricultural centers, Cossack communities, and towns linked by river ports and feeder rails. Wartime mobilization had already drawn thousands into the Red Army and industry, altering local labor and transport patterns. As front lines moved, populations faced repeated evacuations, requisitions, and the competing demands of military transport and harvest. German occupation policy in the south, and Soviet measures to deny resources in the path of a potential retreat, would affect rail timetables, bridge availability, and the condition of depots encountered by advancing units. For both sides, the capacity to manage civilian infrastructure under pressure was not ancillary, but integral to sustaining operations. By late June 1942, the interacting elements, fuel scarcity in the Axis coalition, Soviet reliance on Caucasian output, the geometry of rivers and mountains, and the limits of rail conversion and motor transport had converged into a strategic logic. The campaign to the south promised decisive economic effects if successful, yet it demanded a continuous solution to distance and throughput from the first day. The preconditions thus defined a contest whose outcome would depend not only on tactical engagements, but on whether either side could align plans, rail capacity, bridges, depots, and fuel columns with the speed of maneuver across a theater measured in hundreds of kilometers. At dawn on the 28th of June, 1942, the southern wing of the Eastern Front began to move under a plan divided into phased blows. The first thrust, aimed northeast, committed 4th Panzer Army and elements of 2nd Army toward the Don at Voronezh to unhinge Soviet defenses along the river line and mask the intended descent to the Caucasus. Armored spearheads from 36 and 38 Panzer Corps advanced from the Kursk-Orel sector across steppe country toward Kastornoye and the Voronezh Bend, supported by Luftflotte 4, whose bomber and ground attack groups focused on rail stations and bridges to slow Soviet redeployments. South of this axis, 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army crossed the Oskol and Donets toward the Don's middle reaches, while 17th Army and the Romanian Mountain Corps covered the lower Donets and the approaches to the Sea of Azov. The operational frontage ran from the vicinity of Yelets to Taganrog, with German mobile formations concentrated at several breakout points rather than along a continuous line. Opposite them, Soviet command structures reflected adjustments made after the winter fighting. The Bryansk, southwestern, and southern fronts held the arc from Orel through Kharkiv to the lower Don. Reserve armies assembled east of the Donets and behind Voronezh to absorb or counter local penetrations. Rifle divisions, tank brigades, and independent artillery regiments deployed in depth around rail junctions and river crossings, using urban areas to anchor successive positions. In early July, as the scale of the German advance clarified, Stavka began to reorganize commands. By mid-month, a Stalingrad front formed to manage the Volga-Don sector, and the North Caucasus front was tasked to coordinate the Kuban Terek approaches with the Black Sea Fleet. These adjustments aimed to keep lateral communications functioning while withdrawing heavy equipment and fuel stocks across the Don. The opening movements imposed immediate demands on transport networks. German railway construction staffs expanded standard gauge heads eastward from Kharkiv and Poltava, rebuilt bridges over the Donets, and prepared crossings over the Don. Motorized columns hauled fuel from depots staged around Kupiansk and Sloviansk, calculating daily lifts against march distances that increased as units raced ahead of railheads. Luftwaffe field depots moved forward to maintain sortie rates for Ju-87s, Ju-88s, and Bf-109s operating from step strips. On the Soviet side, the NKPS redirected trains south-north to clear Voronezh yards and routed priority echelons with ammunition and fuel toward the Stalingrad and Caucasus directions. Demolition teams placed charges on bridge piers, trestles, and flyovers, and prepared to burn forward depots if withdrawal became necessary. By July 5th to 7th, German armored battle groups reached the outskirts of Voronezh, after advances measuring more than 150 kilometers along the main roads. Street fighting and counterattacks by Soviet tank brigades slowed the attempt to seize intact crossings. While 4th Panzer Army fought into the city's western districts, infantry formations tightened the perimeter and artillery targeted ferry points. The engagement fulfilled the masking function expected by the German plan. It fixed Soviet reserves along the upper Don and created the impression of a larger offensive toward the middle Volga. Soviet commanders read the situation as a serious threat to the Voronezh-Kastor-Noye line and fed additional formations into the sector, increasing the density of anti-tank and artillery defenses at the river. Further south, 6th Army cleared the Donets Bend and pressed toward the Don's western bank, between Serafimovich and Kalash, while 1st Panzer Army exploited along the lower Donets toward Milarovo and the rail to Rostov-on-Don. The breadth of the advance produced a widening triangle between mobile spearheads and following infantry corps. This geometry raised familiar trade-offs. Pushing armored units rapidly created opportunities to seize bridgeheads, but it also forced supply columns to choose between supporting the northern feint, sustaining the central march to the Don, or preparing the logistics base for a pivot south. Construction units reported that rail conversion could not keep pace with the combined needs of 3 moving axes without prioritization. On 9th to 10th July, the High Command formalized a structural change anticipated in planning. Army Group South divided into 2 headquarters. Army Group B directed 2nd Army, 4th Panzer Army, and 6th Army along the Don and toward the Volga corridor. Army Group A took 1st Panzer Army and 17th Army for the descent into the Caucasus, with Romanian and other Allied units assigned to guard flanks and rear areas. The split reorganized supply channels, depots, and rail priorities. Petroleum shipments sourced from Romania via the lower Danube and Black Sea ports continued to feed Axis depots in Ukraine, but forward allocation now had to support 2 divergent operational goals. The decision aligned with the overarching fuel logic. An eastward thrust aimed to cut Soviet north-south communications and isolate the Caucasus, while the southern thrust targeted the oil fields themselves. Soviet reactions combined holding actions with controlled withdrawals. Units along the middle, Don conducted counterattacks to disrupt bridgehead preparation and artillery emplacements, while the southern front pulled back from the lower Donets to a line covering the approaches to Rostov. Engineering troops dismantled and moved pumping equipment, electric motors, and precision tools from Maikop and Grozny to railheads for shipment east. Local administrations organized evacuation trains for refinery specialists and stored additives required for high-octane aviation gasoline. The Black Sea Fleet coordinated coastal transport to relieve rail congestion, moving fuel and machinery from ports exposed to Luftwaffe attack to more distant harbors. The opening phase also registered its effects on civilians and industry. Towns such as Voronezh, Milarovo, and Shakhty saw factory dismantling, hospital evacuations, and food ration adjustments as the front moved. Agricultural districts faced the overlap of harvest schedules with troop movements and requisitions. German field commands sought to secure intact warehouses and grain elevators to support garrison needs and motor transport fodder, while Soviet authorities executed pre-planned burn orders at depots deemed impossible to hold. Each side's measures influenced the operational tempo. Intact bridges saved days, while a destroyed junction diverted columns onto secondary roads and consumed additional fuel. By the third week of July, German forces took Rostov-on-Don, opening the gateway to the Kuban Plain. At the same time, heavy fighting continued around the Don Loop west of Kalash, with Soviet rifle divisions contesting crossings and deploying anti-tank strongpoints along likely approach roads. The divergence between an eastward drive and a southern descent became visible in map traces and in rail dispatches. Army Group A prepared to push 1st Panzer Army through Novocherkassk towards Salsk, Armavir, and Krasnodar, with 17th Army following on a western route. Army Group B consolidated along the Don to prepare the later move towards Stalingrad. The configuration reflected the initial premise: gain freedom of action by fixing Soviet reserves at the upper Don, while sending mass south to the oil-bearing districts. Throughout these weeks, fuel remained both the cause and the constraint of movement. German armored divisions calculated daily petrol consumption against distances that expanded beyond the range of single refuels, forcing the establishment of intermediate dumps and the use of tanker trains that depended on repaired bridges. Luftwaffe groups adjusted sortie profiles to conserve gasoline and manage engine wear in heat and dust. Soviet commands measured their own fuel draws against the need to keep formations mobile for counterblows and withdrawals, rationing stocks to higher priority sectors and hauling the remainder across crowded lines toward the Volga and the Caucasus interior. The opening phase thus ended with both coalitions in motion, but with the decisive terrain, oil fields, river crossings, and mountain forelands still ahead and tied to the same variable that had framed the plan from the start. German strategic planning for the southern campaign combined an economic target set with an operational design that divided forces and supply. Directive Number 41, issued on the 5th of April, 1942, framed the destruction of Soviet forces in the south as a prerequisite to capturing oil facilities at Maikop and Grozny, with a later thrust against Baku if conditions allowed. Staff studies estimated that Romanian deliveries and domestic synthetics could not meet projected needs for prolonged mobile operations, especially for panzer divisions and Luftflotte 4. The concept therefore linked maneuver speed directly to fuel throughput. Railheads had to advance across the Donets and the Don in step with the spearheads, and forward depots needed bridging equipment, pipeline sections, and tank train cycles scheduled in 72 to 96-hour increments. Planning tables assumed that one standard gauge line converted and kept in service could sustain several hundred tons per day to a single army, but simultaneous drives east and south would require parallel lines or strict prioritization. The force package reflected these constraints. Army Group South's primary mobile striking power centered on 1st Panzer Army and 4th Panzer Army, with 6th Army and 17th Army as heavy infantry groupings. Axis allies were assigned to hold extended river lines and rear zones. Hungarian 2nd Army prepared for the Middle Don sector, Italian 8th Army for a subsequent stretch of the river, and Romanian formations for flanks and mountain approaches. Luftflotte, 4 concentrated bomber, ground attack, and fighter groups to suppress rail nodes and bridgeheads and to provide close support along key corridors. Railway directorates organized field construction brigades, bridge trains, and conversion battalions to push standard gauge eastward from Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk toward Voronezh, Rostov-on-Don, and Armavir. Motor transport regiments were structured into fuel, ammunition, and ration columns, with fixed march intervals to reduce road congestion and to ensure that armored units received petrol within a defined daily window. German intelligence assessments supported a two-pronged design: Photographic reconnaissance and traffic analysis indicated that Soviet reserves were concentrated on the Moscow axis and around the Volga corridor. The plan thus adopted a masking blow toward Voronezh to fix Soviet commands, while the main effort would pivot south once crossings on the Don were secured. A logistics annex set out bridge priorities in sequence. First the Donets crossings to free rail capacity, then the Don at Rostov to unlock the Kuban approaches, and finally the Maikop and Terek lines for deeper movement. Directive number 45 of 23 July 1942 adjusted command architecture by creating Army Group A for the Caucasus and Army Group B for the Don-Volga sector, formalizing separate objectives and distinct supply calendars. The risk was explicit in staff notes. A division of effort increased exposure if rail conversion or bridging lagged behind operational tempo. Soviet planning confronted the same geography from a defensive angle. Stavka directives in June-July organized Stalingrad front for the Volga-Don loop, North Caucasus front for the Kuban and Terek forelands, and Transcaucasus front to anchor the mountain barrier and coastal approaches. Objectives were threefold: delay and attrit enemy spearheads on river lines, evacuate or destroy energy assets and industrial equipment in threatened areas, and preserve mobile reserves to counterstrike at overextended formations. The People's Commissariat of the Oil Industry dispatched teams to dismantle cracking units, compressors, and pumps at Maikop and Grozny, loaded priority wagons with catalysts and spare parts, and prepared demolition packages for storage tanks and pipelines. The NKPS rerouted trains from Rostov-Armavir-Krasnodar lines to alternative corridors and organized river crossings on the lower Don and the Kuban to relieve rail bottlenecks. Soviet air commands allocated fighter and bomber regiments to protect evacuation hubs and to strike river bridges and depots used by the attacker. Operational doctrine on both sides emphasized concentration, but interpreted it differently. German panzer leadership sought deep penetrations to dislocate command and seize crossings intact, maintaining momentum through rapid relief by following infantry corps. This required fuel delivery at the point of decision and a repair system capable of returning vehicles to service after long marches in heat and dust. Soviet doctrine, revised after 1941, stressed echelons in depth and the use of urban areas and rivers to channel armored approaches, with anti-tank strongpoints covering likely road nets and artillery grouped for counter-preparation. Mobile groups of tank and cavalry units were held back to strike flanks of advancing columns once supply lines lengthened. Miscalculations emerged within planning documents. German staff tables projected rail conversion rates that assumed limited partisan interference and rapid bridge reconstruction. Both assumptions proved optimistic when demolitions removed key spans and when single-track routes had to serve two operational axes. Fuel burn estimates for armored divisions in mountain foothills initially used step consumption factors, underestimating the effect of gradients and detours. On the Soviet side, early July assessments weighted the threat to the Voronezh-Kystoynoye sector heavily and committed reserves there, delaying reinforcement of the Caucasus approaches. Only after the fall of Rostov did the southern danger receive commensurate resources. Evacuation plans for Maikop were comprehensive for machinery, but incomplete for experienced crews, forcing later improvisation to restart relocated capacity. Propaganda framed these plans for domestic and allied audiences. German communications argued that access to the Caucasus would resolve fuel shortages and cut the Soviet state from its resource base, presenting the operation as a rational economic step rather than a mere territorial push. Broadcasts emphasized rapid advances and the capture of depots and junctions to signal that the plan remained on schedule. Soviet media highlighted scorched earth measures, civilian participation in fortification work, and the continuity of production despite evacuations, presenting the defense as a coordinated state effort and underscoring the political significance of the Caucasus peoples within the Union. Each narrative aimed to maintain morale and to signal to allies that commitments could be sustained through the campaign's demands. Command structures were tuned to these strategic aims. In Army Group A, 1st Panzer Army prepared thrusts through Salsk and Armavir toward the Kuban Plain, while 17th Army organized for a supporting advance along the Black Sea side with mountain troops and Romanian formations for difficult terrain. In Army Group B, 6th Army and later 4th Panzer Army consolidated along the Don to prepare for a Volga drive that would sever north-south communications. North Caucasus Front tasked rifle armies and independent corps to hold the Terek and the approaches to Grozny, integrating engineer armies for bridge denial and obstacle belts. Transcaucasus Front coordinated with the Black Sea Fleet to secure port movements and with the People's Commissariat of Communications to manage tunnel and pass traffic through the mountains. The strategic logic on both sides thus fused objectives with transport arithmetic. For the attacker, capturing oil centers promised a transformation of supply, but the path required sustained deliveries across converted rails and repaired bridges over distances that compounded daily consumption. For the defender, preserving or denying energy assets while maintaining mobile capacity depended on evacuation discipline, riverline fortification, and the ability to exploit every delay inflicted on the opposing transport plan. By late July 1942, with command splits formalized and river lines contested, the campaign moved from planning tables to the test of whether those assumptions about throughput, timing, and terrain could hold under the pressure of continuous operations. After the capture of Rostov-on-Don on the 23rd to 24th of July 1942, the southern axis unfolded into a sequence of river crossings and urban fights that set character of the Caucasus campaign. Army Group A pushed 1st Panzer Army through Novorossiysk towards Salsk and Tikhvin on the steppe route, while 17th Army advanced along the Black Sea side toward Krasnodar and the lower Kuban. Luftflotte force-shifted bomber groups to strikes on retreat routes across the Don and on the rail nodes feeding the Caucasus, particularly Tikhvin and Armavir. German bridge trains worked on the Rostov spans as pontoon units ferried fuel and ammunition across the river to sustain the first leaps. The immediate Soviet response combined rear guards on the Don's left bank, demolition of depots in the Rostov and Bataysk area, and the redeployment of North Caucasus front formations toward the Kuban foreland and the Terek line. The initial engagements south of the Don centered on bridgeheads and road junctions. German battle groups assembled around Salsk by the end of July after a march of more than 150 kilometers across open steppe, using captured Soviet stocks where available and relying on pre-positioned fuel dumps when demolition teams had succeeded. Elements of 3rd Panzer Corps forced crossings over the Manish and advanced toward Tikhvin, while infantry divisions followed to secure flanks and lines of communication. Soviet rifle divisions, supported by independent anti-tank regiments and field artillery, mounted delaying actions along irrigation canals and rail embankments, exploiting every prepared culvert and trestle as a choke point. Local counterattacks by tank brigades traded ground for time and aimed at fuel columns and bridging parks rather than tank spearheads, a pattern that reflected the priority of slowing rather than halting outright. Further west, the approach to Krasnodar drew 17th Army into a mixed terrain of river meanders, orchards, and low ridges. Bridge seizures over the Kuban's tributaries became the focal points for both sides. German assault detachments attempted dawn crossings under artillery smoke, followed by engineer units laying treadway bridges to bring up anti-tank guns and light vehicles. Soviet defenders used prepared positions on the south banks and set fire to grain stores and farm depots near likely crossing points, both to deny supplies and to reduce cover for attackers. In towns on the Kuban's north bank, civilian administrations organized evacuations for factory workers and hospital staff, while railway crews pushed rolling stock southeast toward Armavir and Maikop. The result was an operational rhythm in which the attacker moved rapidly between nodes when crossings held and slowed markedly when demolitions forced detours. By early August, Army Group A's left wing oriented on the Maikop-Armavir line, and its right wing aimed through Kropotkin toward the Laba River. The tactical picture turned on which side reached each river span intact. German reconnaissance parties entered Maikop's outskirts on August 9, 1942, finding the oil district heavily prepared for denial. Soviet demolition teams had destroyed wellheads, cracking units, and tank farms, with fires and residual fumes complicating movement for several days. Captured infrastructure included administrative buildings and some undamaged pipelines, but core production and refining capacity were left unusable without major repair. For the attacker, the entry into Maikop achieved the immediate terrain objective, but failed to deliver the expected fuel benefit. For the defender, the denial confirmed that prepared measures could offset positional losses if executed to schedule. Across the steppe routes, the speed of movement created gaps between spearheads and following echelons. German panzer divisions entered Armavir's area, while engineers worked to restore rail continuity from Rostov through Tikhvin. Single-track segments and damaged bridges imposed throughput limits, and motor columns shuttled from forward dumps to combat units with march intervals, calculated to keep roads clear for armored elements. On days when airfields near the front could operate, Luftwaffe groups provided close support against Soviet strong points at river crossings, but dust, heat, and the need to move ground crews forward reduced sortie rates. Soviet aviation targeted pontoon parks and traffic jams at defiles, while fighter units contested airspace over Krasnodar and Armavir to protect evacuation trains. Neither side attained undisputed air control. Localized superiority shifted with weather, strip conditions, and rail proximity. The first serious engagements on the approaches to the Terek emerged as the 1st Panzer Army's right advanced toward Mozdok and the lowlands east of the foothills. By the 3rd week of August, vanguards reached the northern bank of the Terek, with reconnaissance probing for fords and intact spans. Soviet commands in the sector concentrated rifle divisions and brought in guard units to stiffen the line, using the river's bends and the marshy ground as natural obstacles. Artillery registered likely crossing sites and held counterattack groups in reserve to hit any footholds. The German plan required bridging in sequence and rapid reinforcement of any lodgment. But the distance from the Don railheads and the consumption of fuel across earlier river lines began to press on timetables. Attempted crossings produced sharp fights at night under illumination, with both sides committing engineers and assault groups in limited but costly actions to hold or eliminate small bridgeheads. On the western axis, battles around Krasnodar and along the lower Kuban continued through mid-August. Urban districts became pivot points for withdrawal and advance. Soviet sappers dropped spans inside the city and along the main road south toward Novorossiysk, redirecting traffic toward mountain approaches. German infantry formations cleared quarter by quarter, pushing defenders across secondary streams and forcing the abandonment of warehouses and workshops that had not already been emptied. Civilian populations experienced successive claims on transport and food stocks, with requisitions by both militaries and movement orders that prioritized factory specialists and rail crews. The short-term outcome was the thinning of local labor pools and the shuttering of small enterprises, which in turn reduced the attackers' ability to source supplies locally during pauses. The distribution of Soviet forces across the North Caucasus and Trans-Caucasus fronts reflected the need to guard multiple routes. While rifle armies held the Terek and the line eastward toward the Caspian, mountain troop detachments and border regiments occupied tracks into the foothills. Partisan groups increased activity against repair crews on the rails feeding the German advance, placing charges on lightly guarded culverts and targeting telegraph lines. German rear area security formations escorted bridge trains and organized blockhouses at intervals along the converted tracks. Reports noted that even brief disruptions at a single culvert could back up supply for hours and alter the resupply sequence for frontline units. The net territorial change by late August registered as a broad German advance of several hundred kilometers from the Don to the Kuban and the Terek, with control asserted over Maikop and parts of the Krasnodar region. Soviet withdrawals remained organized, preserving significant combat strength behind river lines and in urban nodes. Casualty reporting from both sides indicated heavy losses in assault troops and engineers engaged at crossings and in urban clearance, with armored losses tied more to anti-tank ambushes at prepared choke points than to open maneuver battles. Equipment abandonment in the face of blown bridges affected both sides. German columns occasionally destroyed damaged vehicles they could not ferry in time, while Soviet units left heavy guns when rail capacity or tractors were insufficient to extract them across demolished spans. The first engagements therefore set a pattern: rapid German gains where crossings and junctions fell in sequence, sharp slowdowns where demolitions forced bridging and detours, and a consistent Soviet emphasis on time-buying actions, infrastructure denial, and preservation of mobile reserves. The opening battles achieved the geographic precondition for a move on Grozny by establishing positions on the Terek and reducing the Kuban foreland. They did not, however, produce the immediate economic transformation envisioned at the outset, because the critical oil installations encountered had been disabled, and because the distance from base depots stretched the logistics chain with each additional river crossed. The campaign entered a phase of sustained pressure in late August and September 1942, as Army Group A attempted to turn bridgeheads on the Terek into a route toward Grozny, while 17th Army pushed along the Black Sea side toward Novorossiysk and the Tuapse Road. The distances from Rostov railheads to the forward crossings now exceeded 400 to 500 kilometers by road, and every additional river, Manich, Laba, Terek, imposed a new set of bridging and ferry constraints. 3rd Panzer Corps concentrated near Mozdok. Infantry and mountain formations of 49th Mountain Corps and 5th Army Corps advanced on Krasnodar, Novorossiysk, Tuapse axes. Luftflotte 4, supported with bomber and ground attack groups staged from steppe airfields, pushed forward to Armavir and Kropotkin when strips permitted. On the Soviet side, North Caucasus Front assembled the 37th, 9th, 58th, and 44th Armies in sectors from the lower Terek to the coast, and Transcaucasus Front organized reserves along passes leading toward Ordzhonikidze and Grozny. The operational picture shifted from sweeping marches to repeated attempts to widen or eliminate small lodgements on river bends, and to pry open mountain roads that allowed only limited flows of vehicles per day. At Mozdok, the Terek-shaped combat geometry, the river's channels, islands, and marshes forced assaults into predictable corridors marked by levees and causeways. German engineers threw pontoon bridges by night, covered by artillery and short airstrikes at first light. Soviet rifle divisions, reinforced by guard units and anti-tank regiments, counterattacked at dawn to cut bridge exits before enough heavy weapons crossed. The fights around Malgobek and the approaches toward Ordzhonikidze in September showed how narrow frontage magnified the effect of single demolitions. A dropped span over a side canal could isolate a battalion. A mined road cut could stop fuel trucks long enough to force an attack to pause. Reports from both sides noted that armored losses often followed terrain trap engagements at culverts and forest edges rather than open maneuver. The river crossing phase thus became a daily cycle of assembling assault groups, ferrying limited loads, and either exploiting a foothold or pulling back after counterattacks. Further west, Novorossiysk became the anchor of the coastal fight in early September. 17th Army and Romanian Mountain Corps entered the city's northern districts after battles along the Abrau and the cement plant rail sidings. Soviet defenders used harbor moles, warehouses, and the cement works as strong points and maintained ferry routes under artillery fire to move companies between quays. Street-by-street clearance yielded port structures but not uncontested control of the entire harbor. The coastal railway suffered repeated interruptions from demolitions and naval gunfire, complicating German use of the line for heavy logistics. The contest fixed substantial forces that could otherwise have reinforced the Terek front, and the need to guard shoreline routes forced the attacker to disperse mountain and security units across villages and ravines, extending the demand for patrols and small posts. The Tuapse Road demonstrated mountain arithmetic and logistics. The main approaches over the Shalmyan and Peseshko passes narrowed into sequences of hairpins, where only single-file traffic could move. 4,099 Mountain Corps and attached units reported daily march rates measured in tens of kilometers, with intervals for road clearance after landslides or demolitions. Soviet engineer battalions cut galleries, felled trees into switchbacks, and seeded rock faces with charges to trigger controlled falls during attacks. Artillery was winched into position by teams of tractors and trucks, Ammunition resupply followed in small loads. Infantry companies advancing beyond the last bend often faced supply pauses that limited the ability to sustain an assault through a second ridge in the same day. The result was a pattern of gains to the next saddle, a halt for resupply, and night counterattacks by Soviet mountain detachments familiar with local tracks. The symbolic episode of the Elbrus ascent on August 21st by elements of the 1st Mountain Division occurred amidst these practical constraints. Gebirgsjäger detachments reached shelters on the slopes and raised flags on the summit, a demonstration without direct operational leverage on the passes or the Terek bridges. Soviet units in the upper Baksan and along the Klukori and Maruk passes remained in position, blocking a direct drive over the central spine. Snowfields and early autumn weather further reduced the feasibility of moving substantial mechanized forces across high routes, and both sides focused instead on lower corridors where roads supported motor traffic. Grozny and its refineries became the central objective east of the mountains. Luftwaffe raids in September and October targeted storage tanks and cracking plants to complement ground efforts at Mozdok and Malgobek. Soviet air defense units deployed additional guns around refineries and rail yards. Camouflage nets, smoke generators, and decoy fires sought to mislead attackers. Dismantling teams continued to remove compressors, electric motors, and specialized tools to the east. On the ground, the Terek line held, with Soviet counterattacks from the south bank into German bridgeheads limiting depth of penetration. Attempts to swing around the left toward the Sunja and approach the city from the northwest encountered mined fields and marshy ground that constrained armor. The closer the attacker drew to the refineries, the denser the belt of obstacles, trenches, and urban preparation. Supply tables for both coalitions now drove tempo. For the attacker, the single-track standard gauge line running Rostov, Tikhoretsk, Armavir, Maikop fed two divergent consumers, the Terek axis and the coastal axis. Repair of bridges on the Laba and the removal of wreckage from sidelines consumed engineering brigades needed further forward. Motor columns had to consume fuel to deliver fuel. The ratio grew unfavorable as distances lengthened and as road wear increased breakdowns. For the defender, evacuating oil assets and heavy equipment competed with the movement of troops and ammunition toward threatened sectors. NKPS dispatchers allocated track windows to military echelons and to trains loaded with refinery machinery. Delays at tunnels and bridges multiplied as air attacks and sabotage forced temporary closures. Both sides prioritized bridge security with guard posts, searchlights, and patrols to reduce the risk of night raids. Casualty and equipment attrition reflected the character of the fights. Assault engineers and infantry tasked with river crossings and urban clearance incurred heavy losses relative to armored formations operating in a supporting role on restricted ground. German tank battalions reported a growing share of vehicles in short-term repair due to suspension and engine wear from long road marches and dust ingestion, while Soviet tank brigades expended their strength in counterattacks at choke points and required replenishment that often lagged rail deliveries. Artillery ammunition consumption rose on both sides. Short-range duels at crossings and on urban fringes demanded high rates of smoke, high explosive, and illumination. Civilian experiences along the Kuban and Terek corridors showed a different metric of escalation. Evacuations of refinery specialists, hospital staff, and rolling stock crews reconfigured towns into transient camps with ration adjustments and curfews. Agricultural districts faced requisitions at harvest time to feed troops and to provide fodder for draft animals moving guns in the mountains. River ferries carried mixed loads of soldiers, wounded, and displaced families. Administrative orders alternated between directing returns to work after a front stabilized and renewing evacuations when a bridge fell or a road reopened. The constant movement strained medical and sanitation services and altered labor availability for both militaries that depended on local work parties for road and bridge repair. By late September, the attacker held Maikop and most of the Krasnodar region north of the main river, bridgeheads on the Terek near Mozdok, and positions in Novorossiysk's industrial districts. The defender held Grozny, Orjonikidze, and the Tuapse approaches. and maintained forces in depth east of the Terek and behind the coastal ridges. The crisis phase emerged from arithmetic rather than a single defeat. The same fuel that motivated the operation had to cross every bridge and hairpin to sustain it, while the oil installations seized intact were few, and those encountered in Maikop were disabled. The coming weeks would determine whether a concentrated push could break the remaining river and mountain barriers before autumn weather, and the accumulation of small delays converted operational reach into a ceiling that could not be raised by additional orders or local successes. Through October 1942, the Southern Theater reached its operational maximum as Army Group A attempted synchronized blows along 3 corridors, from the Mozdok bridgeheads toward Malgobek and Ordzhonikidze, along the Black Sea coast toward Tuapse, and across the Kuban lowlands to stabilize Novorossiysk's harbor district. The configuration reflected the ambition to turn river footholds into access to Grozny while sealing the coast to deny the defender lateral movement. 3 Panzer Corps massed near Mozdok for a push between the Terek and Sunja. Infantry and mountain corps pressed the Tuapse road over successive ridges, and composite groups rotated through block-by-block fighting inside Novorossiysk's industrial zone. Luftflotte 4 apportioned bomber and ground attack sorties to cover bridges, road bottlenecks, and refinery districts. But the need to sustain operations along the Don and the Volga limited continuous concentration over the Caucasus. On the Soviet side, North Caucasus Front reinforced the Malgobek sector with guard formations, while Transcaucasus Front prepared counterattack groupings behind Ordzhonikidze and strengthened air defenses around Grozny's refineries and rail yards. Coastal armies held the Tuapse approaches and maintained ferry links that kept small unit movements possible even when roads closed. The Terek-Sunja line became the fulcrum. Assault groups assembled before dawn. Engineers ferried assault boats through reed beds, and artillery marked lanes across the northern bank. Once a foothold formed, anti-tank guns and light howitzers were manhandled over pontons to stabilize the perimeter. The opposing calculation matched pace. Soviet rifle regiments counterattacked at first light to cut bridge exits and prevent consolidation, using short, violent thrusts by tank brigades along levees. The fighting around Malgobek in early October showed the limit of frontal pressure in broken, marsh-fringed ground. Gains measured in villages and factory hamlets, then receded when a culvert or a trestle fell behind the point units. German armored battalions increasingly fought as packets tied to road nets, while Soviet artillery registered every bend capable of taking a tank. Each crossing consumed bridging equipment, fuel, and time that could not be replaced quickly from the Rostov-Tikhoretsk railhead. To the west, the Tuapse offensive reached its highest pitch in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of October. Mountain and infantry divisions advanced ridge by ridge, with companies dispersed along knife-edge spurs and ravines. The road over Shaumyan Pass narrowed into single-file sections, where breakdowns halted entire columns. Tractors and teams hauled guns around blasted corners. Soviet engineer units used delayed charges to drop rock faces during attacks, and cut galleries to shelter reserves from air observation. Artillery duels in the passes relied on mules and hand-carry to feed guns. When a saddle fell, the attacker faced a second line within a few kilometers, and night counterattacks by Soviet mountain troops forced repeated withdrawals to the last defensible curve. The arithmetic favored the defense. Even modest daily rainfall multiplied delays, and each detour added fuel burn that supply tables had not allocated when the operation was planned on step consumption rates. Inside Novorossiysk, combat settled into a duel over harbor moles, cement works, and rail sidings. German infantry cleared warehouses under covering fire from field guns brought to direct fire positions. Soviet Marines and rifle battalions used the port's concrete structures as mutually supporting strong points. Ferries under artillery and air harassment moved companies and ammunition across short gaps. The coastal railway, intermittently repaired, could not be relied on for sustained heavy traffic. Demolitions and naval gunfire reopened breaks just repaired the previous day. Control of map squares changed hands more than once, but the port did not yield as an intact logistics base that could relieve pressure on the Terek axis. Maikop's oil district, held since August, failed to deliver the hoped-for transformation at the operational peak. German technical teams and construction units surveyed wellheads and cracking units, replaced valves, and attempted to restore pumping on a limited basis, but the systematic demolitions and removal of key machinery left only fragments of capacity. Fuel for the forward armies continued to derive from Romanian shipments, and inland depots moved east by rail and road. Every kilometer beyond Armavir increased the proportion of petrol consumed in delivery rather than combat. On days when weather grounded sorties or dust storms cut visibility on step strips, armored spearheads waited for tanker columns that had themselves paused for bridge repairs or route clearance. Soviet air and artillery interdiction intensified. Fighter groups contested the Mozdok-Ordzhonikidze airspace, focusing on ponton parks and road echelons. Bomber regiments struck forward dumps identified by aerial reconnaissance and local guides. Around Grozny, layered anti-aircraft belts and smoke generators reduced bombing accuracy against refinery targets, while demolition crews prepared secondary denial if the line broke. On the ground, the defense hinged on small, durable strongpoints tied to terrain. Orchards, levees, factory grounds, augmented by mines and short-range anti-tank guns, placed to cover likely turnouts from the road. When German assaults penetrated a first belt, counterattack groups composed of tanks and submachine gun companies hit flanks at culverts and crossroads to restore the line. The highest German attempt toward Ordzhonikidze in late October and early November concentrated 2 panzer divisions with supporting infantry and artillery along a narrow frontage. Initial advances crossed the Sand and Ardon tributaries and reached the outskirts where urban preparation met road-bound armor. Soviet reserves counterattacked from multiple directions, and the narrow supply corridor, bridged at several points and vulnerable to fire from the flanks, struggled to feed fuel and ammunition forward at the necessary rate. A local encirclement formed around elements of a German panzer regiment near Giselle, when a bridge was dropped behind them and counterattacks cut road exits. Relief efforts under air cover extracted parts of the force, but losses in vehicles and bridging equipment exceeded daily repair capacity and forced a withdrawal to more defensible ground along the Terek. The episode illustrated the cumulative effect of distance and constrained routes. Tactical success at one bend could not be converted into an operational breach without throughput the line could not sustain. Civilian and industrial dynamics at the peak mirrored the military ceiling. Grozny's administrations kept refineries partially active for military needs, while accelerating evacuation of specialist crews and tools. When raids intensified, production paused and resumed in intervals. Along the Kuban, harvest and military transport overlapped, and requisitions drew on stocks that local authorities had already diverted east. In mountain districts, villages supported troop movements with labor for road clearance and casualty evacuation, while periodic evacuations created cycles of departure and return as lines fluctuated. These flows affected both coalitions. The attacker relied on local labor parties to clear slides and repair culverts. The defender depended on rail crews and refinery staff to keep industry functioning under fire. By the end of October, the map showed the greatest territorial extent of the southern advance. Maikop held, Novorossiysk partially occupied, bridgeheads on the Terek near Mozdok, and positions within striking distance of Ordzhonikidze. Yet the conditions that enabled the advance, fast exploitation after Rostov, intact crossings seized in sequence, had given way to repeated bridging and mountain problems that multiplied consumption and slowed tempo. At the same time, demands elsewhere in the theater competed for the same transport and air assets, reducing the ability to mass support in the Caucasus for more than a few days at a time. For the defender, the peak confirmed that layered rivers, prepared urban zones, and mountain roads could convert numerical or qualitative advantages in local engagements into time, which in turn allowed reinforcement and industry evacuation to stay ahead of capture. The culmination point arrived not as a single failed attack, but as a line of constraints becoming concurrent. Bridges requiring repair faster than engineers could replace them, roads whose gradients transformed fuel tables, aircraft maintenance cycles stretched by heat and dust, and industrial sites that, when reached, no longer offered immediate supply. In that environment, tactical successes incurred disproportionate logistic costs, and each pause invited counteraction that eroded the attackers to resume at the same scale. The campaign had reached its peak of exertion without achieving the decisive aims against Grozny's refineries or a breakthrough beyond the Terek into the lowlands east, setting the stage for a winter in which distance, terrain, and competing priorities would define outcomes more than any single planned blow. Adaptation shaped the conduct of both coalitions after October 1942, as operational momentum gave way to attrition. On the attackers' side, headquarters redistributed engineer battalions from the coast to the Mozdok sector to replace destroyed pontons and to lay heavier bridges capable of passing tanks and fuel trucks on the same structure rather than in alternating cycles. Motor transport regiments reorganized columns into shorter packets with fixed intervals to reduce road closures at culverts and hairpins. Field workshops increased forward repair capacity by setting up in school buildings and farm sheds, aiming to return vehicles to service within 24 to 48 hours for minor suspension and cooling faults. Assault detachments included more engineers and flame sections to break trench lines on levees and factory grounds, and reconnaissance units took on route security tasks normally performed by infantry to keep supply moving between the Terek and the lower Laba. Luftwaffe groups shifted to shorter-range missions with higher sortie counts, emphasizing dawn attacks on bridgeheads and ferry points that could be reached from Armavir and Kropotkin strips without staging. The defenders' adaptation emphasized depth and economy of force. North Caucasus front structured sectors into belts anchored on rivers and urban fringes, with rifle divisions holding primary lines and guards units positioned for counterattacks against bridge exits. Anti-tank regiments deployed in small packets with 45mm and 76mm guns to cover turns and culverts, supported by mortar concentrations pre-registered on road nets. The Trans-Caucasus Front organized mobile groups that combined tank brigades with cavalry for movement along tracks parallel to roads, striking columns at intervals and withdrawing before air response could concentrate. NKPS dispatchers implemented night-heavy timetables for military echelons to reduce exposure to daylight air attack, extended blackout zones around key junctions, and constructed bypass loops around damaged yards at Kropotkin and Armavir to keep single-track throughput within planned limits. Black Sea Fleet and river flotillas increased short-hop convoys carrying ammunition and fuel to Tuaps and coastal landings that relieved pressure on clogged mountain roads. Partisan and security dynamics intensified across the rear. Soviet partisan detachments in the Kuban lowlands and along the rail from Rostov to Tikhoretsk focused on culverts, telegraph lines, and lightly guarded bridges, employing charges measured to break a span without collapsing the embankment, which forced repeated repairs and kept the line closed for hours. German security regiments, police battalions, and Allied units manned blockhouses and patrols at intervals, escorted bridge trains, and organized rapid repair teams that carried prefabricated beams. Reports from both sides recorded a pattern in which a single interruption at a culvert delayed a day's sequence of tanker trains, and the missed cycle then propagated forward as fuel columns arrived late to the Mozdok sector. The cumulative effect translated directly into reduced daily attempts at crossings, or into the cancellation of planned night attacks when bridging parks could not be replenished. Resource management became a daily ledger. The attacker recorded petrol allocations by division and often shifted fuel from coastal formations to reinforce the Terek corridor when weather-grounded air operations on one side, but not the other. Emergency measures included pressing captured tractors and civilian trucks into service and organizing horse-drawn trains to move ammunition where gradients defeated motor transport. Technical teams at Maikop restarted a limited number of wells and attempted improvised distillation to produce small tonnages of motor spirit and lubricants, but output remained marginal against consumption. A panzer division at normal tempo could draw dozens of tons per day, while restored capacity yielded only fractions of that figure. The defender rationed fuel for counterattack groups and prioritized rail haulage for artillery ammunition and bridging material. Refinery evacuation trains carried compressors, catalysts, and spare parts, while demolition teams prepared to destroy remaining tanks if the line bent again. Innovation appeared in small increments. German bridging units experimented with mixed timber and steel spans to cross canals whose banks would not bear standard pontons, and road units laid prefabricated mats over marshy verges to allow bypasses around blown culverts. Soviet engineers used delayed fuses to drop spans after the first enemy vehicles crossed, attempting to isolate spearheads, and constructed decoy bridges and fuel dumps under camouflage nets and smoke generators to complicate air targeting. Air defenses around Grozny layered light and heavy guns with searchlights. Dummy flares and smoke pots misled night raiders. Both sides increased the use of radio deception. The attacker cycled call signs to mask unit identities as divisions rotated. The defender transmitted false train schedules to disrupt anticipated interdiction. The psychological and organizational loads surfaced in personnel measures. The attacker shortened rest cycles, rotated assault companies between sectors, and consolidated depleted battalions to maintain unit integrity. Leave to the rear decreased as rail priority favored fuel and ammunition. The defender moved experienced crews from evacuated refineries eastward and replaced them with cadres able to keep essential services running under intermittent bombardment. Rifle divisions received drafts from interior districts, and training cadres accelerated courses on anti-tank tactics suited to levees and urban fringes. Medical services on both sides expanded forward dressing stations near crossings and passes. Evacuation chains used ferries and narrow-gauge lines, where road congestion made motor evacuation unreliable. Counterattacks defined the rhythm around Ordzhonikidze and the Malgobek sector in late October and early November. After German units reached the city's outskirts, Soviet reserves struck at road exits and bridge approaches with tank brigades supported by rifle regiments, aiming to cut the corridor at multiple points. Local encirclements formed when a culvert collapse or a dropped span separated forward tanks from their supply elements. The attacker responded with relief thrusts and concentrated artillery to reopen roads, but each episode consumed bridging stores and fuel that could not be quickly replaced. Comparative strengths in these actions varied by day. German assault groups often numbered battalion to regimental size with attached tanks and engineers. Soviet counterattack packets combined similar-sized rifle elements with 10 to 30 tanks, depending on serviceable numbers and fuel on hand. The outcomes measured not only ground gained, but equipment left unrecoverable when extraction failed before daylight. Along the coast, adaptation reduced the scale of objectives, but improved staying power. Instead of continuous drives for 2 apps, the attacker focused on taking successive ridges and securing them with field fortifications to shorten lines and free units for rotation. Supply enlisted local labor parties to clear slides and repair galleries. Mule trains augmented truck columns where gradients exceeded vehicle limits. The defender increased artillery registered on road bends and improved communications along hidden tracks to allow company-sized night movements without detection. Naval guns and mortars targeted roadheads when weather permitted observation from the sea, adding another layer of disruption to daytime traffic. The civilian environment responded in parallel. Municipal councils in the Kuban and the Terek sectors reissued work and evacuation orders as lines shifted. Schools and warehouses became barracks and hospitals. Ration scales adjusted to prioritize rail and refinery personnel. Agricultural deliveries continued under requisition, with grain and fodder routed to depots serving both armies depending on control of a given district on a given week. In Grozny, refinery output for military needs was scheduled around air raid patterns, and smoke generators that protected installations also reduced visibility on adjacent roads, slowing movement for both sides during alarms. By mid-November, the adaptation cycle had produced measurable effects. The attacker's daily attempt rate at the Terek fell as bridging stocks required replenishment and as fuel cycles lengthened to cover detours and repairs. Coastal operations stabilized into positional fights with limited, costly gains per ridge. The defenders' layered defense held Grozny and the mountain gates, sustained by rail timetables that, while congested, continued to deliver ammunition and reinforcements at night. Neither side achieved decisive air control. Localized superiority shifted with weather and strip availability. The result was an equilibrium defined by throughput and terrain. Each improvement in technique or organization yielded incremental advantages, but the central constraints, distance from Rostov railheads for the attacker, the need to preserve industrial capacity under fire for the defender, remained. The campaign's next phase would turn on whether winter conditions and the broader theater's demands altered those balances more than any single tactical innovation could. The decisive shift came from outside the Caucasus. 19 November 1942, Soviet forces opened Operation Uranus against the flanks of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, striking primarily Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies with massed armor and artillery. Within 4 days, the pincers closed at Kalag, encircling approximately 290,000 Axis personnel in and around the city. A second series of blows, Operation Saturn in mid-December, and the scaled Little Saturn later that month, drove west and south against Italian 8th Army and the rear of Army Group Dawn. The consequences for the Caucasus were immediate. The Axis line of communications through the Don-Rostov corridor faced the prospect of being cut, and the armies on the Terek and in the Kuban risked isolation measured in rail spans and road choke points rather than in map distance alone. Command structures adjusted to the new geometry. On 21st to 22nd November, Army Group Dawn formed under Erich von Manstein to manage the Stalingrad crisis and the Don Bend, while Army Group A, command now concentrated under Ewald von Kleist, retained responsibility for the Caucasus. Hitler's initial directives stressed holding positions on the Terek and the coast, while a relief effort toward Stalingrad took shape. Field headquarters in the Caucasus translated those orders into a defensive posture along existing bridgeheads, conserving fuel and ammunition for counterattacks against Soviet probes across the river. The margin for error narrowed. A single bridge failure on the Rostov crossings, or a Soviet thrust to the lower Don, could strand 1st Panzer Army and 17th Army south of the Manish. Soviet planning exploited that vulnerability. Stavka directed North Caucasus Front to maintain pressure on the Mozdok-Malgobek sector and to probe for crossings toward the Sunja, while Transcaucasus Front prepared groupings to counter any renewed Axis drive on Ordzhonikidze. Simultaneously, the larger operational design aimed to sever the Rostov Gate by breaking Axis allied armies west of the Don. Soviet strength committed to Uranus and Saturn exceeded 1 million personnel across the broader theater, with hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns. Forces on the Caucasus sector were smaller but coordinated to tie down German formations that might otherwise move north. The turning point thus combined a strategic encirclement with localized pressure designed to convert the attackers' extended lines into liabilities. In early December, Manstein's attempt to reach Stalingrad, Operation Winter Storm, advanced from Kotelnikovo with LVI's Panzer Corps, but stalled short of the city after hard fighting against Soviet mobile reserves. The failure to reopen the Volga corridor froze the relief prospect and reweighted the calculus in the south. Army Group A's staffs assessed rail conversion, bridge conditions, and fuel on hand against force groupings south of the Don. Daily reports recorded petrol levels for panzer divisions at rates that allowed only limited offensive action. Luftflotte 4 divided sorties between the Don-Volga sector and the Caucasus, reducing sustained concentration over Mozdok or the Tuapse Road. The cumulative effect was a strategic dilemma. To hold the Caucasus meant risking the loss of the armies stationed there. To withdraw meant conceding the oil districts that had framed the campaign's purpose. By mid-December, the decision aligned with logistics. Orders initiated phased withdrawals from the Terek bridgeheads to the Kumamanik line. Engineer units dismantled ponton parks under cover of darkness. Rear guards laid mines on levees and dropped secondary spans to delay pursuit. Motor columns prioritized fuel, bridging gear, and artillery over heavy equipment that could not be towed. Damaged tanks beyond quick repair were demolished in place. The movement occurred under pressure from Soviet reconnaissance in force across the Terek and from artillery harassing fire on known road nets. On the coast, 17th Army consolidated positions around Novorossiysk and the approaches to Tuapse, preparing to trade depth for time with successive ridgeline defenses as units disengaged from exposed salients. Soviet forces translated the strategic turn into a series of local advances. Rifle divisions crossed the Terek at selected points after Axis withdrawals began, occupying Mozdok and pushing south toward Alagir and the lower slopes guarding Ordzhonikidze. Anti-tank and artillery positions that had held bridge exits in October now served as springboards for advances to the next canal or rail embankment. The tempo remained deliberate. Marsh ground and demolished infrastructure forced engineers to repair or bridge much of the same terrain the attacker had struggled over in summer. Along the coast, Soviet Marines and rifle regiments pushed inside Novorossiysk's industrial districts, contesting warehouses and yards while coastal artillery interdicted roadheads. The objective was not a rapid breakthrough, but the continuous narrowing of the attacker's options as the Don crossing zones came under threat from the north. The Rostov hinge dominated every calculation. Axis throughput from Romania and inland depots converged on that node. Soviet operations aimed to bring artillery within range of the bridges and to break Allied armies holding the Middle Don. As Little Saturn unfolded in late December, Italian 8th Army suffered heavy losses and a retreat opened gaps that Soviet mobile groups exploited toward Milerovo and Morozovsk. The prospect of a southward turn into the lower Don basin forced Army Group A to accelerate its withdrawals. Columns moved along iced roads where breakdowns multiplied. Bridge trains leapfrogged to reconstruct spans on the Manish and the lower Don that had been only lightly repaired during the advance. Air support covered choke points, but winter weather grounded sorties on key days, and traffic piled up at single-lane crossings. The turning point registered in comparative force ratios at the front, where 3rd Panzer Corps had concentrated several divisions against the Malgobek-Ordzhonikidze axis in October. The same ground in late December saw reduced Axis strength tasked with covering withdrawals and protecting engineer work. Soviet Rifle Corps, reinforced with tank brigades as fuel permitted, pushed on a broader frontage, accepting attrition to maintain pressure, rather than seeking deep encirclements in terrain that still punished rapid movement. Casualty reports reflected the changed aims. German losses peaked in rear guard actions and demolition parties. Soviet losses concentrated in assault engineers and forward rifle battalions, clearing mined culverts and destroyed bridges. Civilian patterns inverted with the direction of movement. Towns that had served as Axis forward bases, Maikop, Armavir, Kropotkin, saw evacuations of German hospital installations and supply depots, requisition of civilian carts for hauling, and the destruction of stores that could not be carried. Soviet authorities re-entered with repair brigades and NKPS teams to reopen yards and to restart utilities, while refinery cadres assessed what could be salvaged from structures damaged in August demolitions and subsequent fighting. Along the mountain roads, local labor parties once hired to clear slides for an advance now worked under orders to reopen routes for a pursuit. Ration scales and curfews changed sign, but the underlying strain on transport, food, and shelter remained. By the first week of January 1943, the operational turn was complete. Army Group A fell back from the Terek to the Kumamanich, and then toward the Kuban, aiming to pass large formations back through the Rostov corridor before Soviet advances from the north closed the gate. In the east, Grozny remained in Soviet hands. In the west, the fight for Novorossiysk continued at close quarters, but no longer promised an Axis breakthrough to two ops. The drive that had begun in June to seize oil and sever the Soviet South now confronted its own supply arithmetic. Distance and terrain, magnified by a strategic encirclement far to the northeast, reduced freedom of action to the problem of extracting armies intact across rivers and single-track bottlenecks. The turning point, therefore, was not a single clash on the Terek or a final battle on a mountain road. It was the collision of a theater-wide counteroffensive with a campaign already at its logistics ceiling. Once the Stalingrad pocket formed and the Don flank cracked, every kilometer south of Rostov translated into added risk with diminishing returns. The same variables that had constrained summer success, bridges, railheads, fuel cycles, now defined the terms of retreat. What followed would be measured by how many formations crossed back over the Don, and what physical and industrial ground changed hands during the winter pursuit toward the Kuban and the Lower Don. January 1943 opened with a controlled retreat south of the Don that aimed to preserve formations and equipment while denying infrastructure to the pursuer. Army Group A issued phase schedules for crossings over the Manish and the Lower Don, with priorities set for fuel, artillery, bridging gear, and repair workshops. Bridge trains leapfrogged in sequence, one span in service, one under repair, and one prefabricated on the next site. Rear guards, infantry battalions with attached anti-tank guns and engineers, held levees and canal bends until darkness, then withdrew after demolition teams fired charges. Motor transport was reorganized into packets that moved by interval through single-lane bridges to reduce stalls from breakdowns. Axis Allied units covered flanks and escorted columns, while Luftwaffe detachments flew weather-limited sorties to mask bottlenecks with smoke and to attack assembling Soviet ponton parks on the Terek and Kuma. Soviet commands kept pressure steady rather than risking overextension in terrain that still punished rapid movement. North Caucasus Front advanced through Mozdok and Malgobek on a frontage of river bends and marsh islands, clearing mines and repairing culverts. Rifle divisions moved with engineer battalions and bridging companies forward of artillery, using captured causeways and the embankments of local rail spurs as firing lines. Tank brigades were committed in short thrusts at road nodes to dislodge rear guards and to seize intact workshops and dumps when possible. On the coast, Marines and rifle regiments expanded footholds inside Novorossiysk, pushing through the cement plant districts and along harbor moles under cover from coastal artillery. The objective was cumulative. Each repaired trestle and reopened culvert shortened the interval to the next Axis demolition and increased pressure on the withdrawal timetable toward Rostov. Rostov-on-Don, retaken by Soviet forces on the 14th of February 1943, functioned as the hinge. In late January and early February, Axis columns streamed through the crossing zones amid freezing rain and snow that alternately iced planks and turned approach roads into rutted mud. Traffic officers enforced order of march tables to prevent supply echelons from intermixing with hospital trains and artillery convoys. When Soviet mobile groups approached the Lower Don from the north after the collapse of Allied formations on the Middle Don, demolition parties dropped additional spans as insurance and mined approach cuts. The result was an exodus completed under pressure, but without the encirclement that had trapped formations at Stalingrad. Formations that had fought on the Terek and the Tuapse Road passed to the West Bank and continued toward the Kuban and the Taman Peninsula. Industrial and civilian transitions followed the military movement in quick cycles. In Maikop, German technical teams dismantled salvageable pumps and electrical gear before withdrawing. Demolition charges finished structures damaged since August. Soviet repair commissions re-entered behind the front with lists of compressors, valves, and catalysts evacuated months earlier, assessing which units could be reinstalled. Grozny, never captured, accelerated restart schedules for units that had paused under air attack, prioritizing aviation gasoline and diesel for front needs. Railway officials reopened yards at Armavir and Kropotkin under blackout, and with limited signaling, routing first ammunition and bridging trains, then food and medical echelons, and only later civilian freight. Local administrations processed returns by refinery and rail specialists while maintaining evacuation for districts still under intermittent shelling. Along the Black Sea, the disengagement from forward positions around Tuapse and within Novorossiysk translated into a new defensive geometry. German 17th Army, reinforced by security and construction units, organized a fortified zone across the Taman Peninsula, integrating fieldworks with natural obstacles between the Kuban estuaries and the Azov shore. Bypasses and ferry points multiplied to keep traffic flowing when a span failed. Soviet planners, facing a peninsula with limited approaches, prepared for combined operations. Coastal landings to widen footholds near Novorossiysk, artillery concentrations to suppress roadheads, and engineer efforts to bridge lowland streams under observation. While the peninsula fight would reach its main phase later in 1943, the winter months set the lines and stockpiles that determined the pace of the coming contest. The retreat north of the Caucasus brought changes in force composition and equipment status. German armored units reported a higher proportion of vehicles in short-term repair compared to September. Engines showed dust and heat wear from the summer and autumn campaigns, and suspensions bore signs of mountain road stresses. Field workshops returned some tanks to service using cannibalized parts, but others were destroyed when transport could not be spared. Artillery withdrew with reduced stockpiles. Ammunition columns prioritized high explosive and smoke for rearguard tasks and bridge defense. Soviet formations advancing through recovered towns documented abandoned or destroyed vehicles at blown spans and culverts and noted the same pattern on their side. Heavy guns left when tractors failed, mines emplaced hurriedly by units racing to keep contact. Casualty reporting diverged by sector. Axis losses clustered in rearguards and demolition parties. Soviet losses concentrated in engineers and forward rifle battalions engaged in clearance under fire. Population movements reversed direction. Civilians who had fled in summer drifted back along reopened lines, confronting housing damaged by earlier urban fighting and recent demolitions. In the Kuban, agricultural committees synchronized planting with military traffic, and requisitions resumed under new authorities with different priorities. In the mountains, villages that had served as staging points for both armies faced renewed demands for labor to clear slides, repair galleries, and restore water and power. Health services changed hands with speed. Temporary military hospitals departed with the withdrawal, and Soviet medical teams opened facilities in schools and depots within days, treating both civilians and re-entered labor cadres. The logistical burden of relief, food, coal, medical supplies, competed with military haulage on single-track lines, a competition resolved day by day, according to front priority. Strategically, the withdrawal rebalanced the southern theater. The Mias and Lower Don river lines, reoccupied by Axis forces in February-March, offered stronger lateral communications than the Terek-Sunja corridor, and allowed a closer tie-in with Army Group South's remaining rail network. For the Soviet side, the return of the Kuban and the security of Grozny and Ordzhonikidze removed the immediate threat to the core of the oil industry and freed formations for operations against the Lower Don and the Taman Peninsula. Air forces redistributed accordingly, Luftflotte. Four concentrated more on the Donets and Azov littoral. Soviet air commands extended protection over rail hubs supporting the advance and shifted bomber regiments to interdict the peninsula crossings. Neither side achieved continuous air dominance. Winter weather and field strip conditions kept the air war episodic and localized. Materially, the central premise of the 1942 operation stood reversed. The attacker withdrew without securing functional oil capacity at Maikop, and without reaching Grozny, fuel for ongoing operations continued to rely on Romanian supply and synthetic output, now under growing threat from the broader theater's demands. The defender retained refinery districts and recovered rail nodes necessary to supply subsequent offensives. Quantitatively, changes could be traced in transport arithmetic rather than in a single decisive count. A standard gauge line serviceable to Armavir under the attacker became, after repair, a line feeding advances to Kropotkin and beyond. A ponton park that had supported assaults on the Terek became bridging stock for Soviet river crossings in pursuit. The same bridges, culverts, and yards that had governed the march south now governed the return. By March 1943, the front stabilized with Axis forces holding the Taman bridgehead and the Lower Don Mias positions, and Soviet armies consolidating gains across the North Caucasus and along the Azov shore. The immediate consequences were clear in the ledger of ground and industry. Grozny's refineries operated under strengthened air defenses. Maikop's district remained damaged but under repair. Novorossiysk's harbor districts were contested at close quarters, with localized control shifting by day. Humanitarian pressures persisted in towns where winter met, disrupted infrastructure. Fuel shortages for civilian heat and transport remained acute until rail deliveries normalized. The military problem for both coalitions shifted from long-distance advance to positional fights over peninsulas and river lines, with the knowledge acquired over months that bridges, railheads, and fuel cycles would again decide how quickly and how far any next movement could go. The outcome of the 1942 Southern Campaign reordered priorities for both coalitions and established constraints that lasted to the war's end. For Germany, the withdrawal from the Caucasus without functional oil acquisitions meant that fuel in 1943 continued to derive from Romanian production and synthetic plants in Upper Silesia and the Ruhr. Allocation tables kept Panzer and Luftwaffe units on ration schedules even during preparations for summer operations elsewhere. The rail and pipeline network connecting Ploiesti to forward depots remained a single vulnerable system guided through the lower Danube and Carpathian corridors. The intended transformation, replacing imported tonnage with captured Caucasian output, did not occur. The forces that had reached the Terek and Novorossiysk returned to positions closer to their main railheads, but the months invested in bridging stocks consumed limited the capacity to expand reserves for later campaigns. On the Soviet side, the defense of Grozny and the recovery of the Kuban and North Caucasus secured the core of fuel supply for 1943. Grozny and Baku continued to deliver aviation gasoline and diesel after periods of reduced output during air raids. Maikop's district remained damaged through 1943, but elements were gradually restored. The evacuation of compressors, cracking units, and skilled crews earlier in 1942 shortened restart cycles in recovered areas east of the Volga. Rail and river lines cleared during the winter enabled the movement of fuel and heavy equipment for planned offensives in the Donbass and on the Azov littoral. Industrial continuity, rather than territorial expansion alone, marked the strategic effect. An oil system centered on Transcaucasia and the lower Volga remained in Soviet hands and supplied fronts from the central sector to the Black Sea. The territorial map that emerged by March 1943 fixed a new set of operational problems. Axis forces held the Taman Peninsula and the lower Don Mias lines. Soviet forces prepared to reduce the Taman bridgehead and to push into the Donbass. Fighting at Novorossiysk continued until September 1943, when combined coastal and land operations forced a withdrawal from the peninsula. The Blue Line fortifications, built during the first half of 1943, delayed but did not prevent Soviet advances once artillery massed and crossings were established. The campaigns that followed remained tethered to the same transport arithmetic learned in 1942. Single-track segments, bridge capacities, and road gradients governed how quickly formations could be supplied and rotated, regardless of tactical events on a given day. The distribution of losses reflected the character of the southern fighting. Assault engineers, bridging troops, and infantry committed to river lines and urban districts incurred high casualties on both sides, relative to armored units that often fought as roadbound packets. Equipment write-offs clustered around destroyed crossings and culverts where recovery was impossible under fire or within available time. Comparative force strengths fluctuated by sector and month. German 3rd Panzer Corps and supporting infantry reached the Terek with several divisions in September. October 1942, Soviet North Caucasus and Transcaucasus fronts fielded multiple rifle armies with attached tank brigades on the same fronts. The scale never approached the mass engaged around the Volga, but the operational effect of each battalion and bridge train was magnified by terrain that forced concentration in narrow corridors. Doctrinal lessons entered manuals and staff practice. German headquarters revised estimates for fuel burns in foothill and mountain operations, increased the standard stock of bridging material allotted to Panzer Corps, and emphasized earlier conversion of secondary rail lines to expand throughput beyond a single axis. Luftwaffe Field commands adjusted maintenance schedules for operations from dusty steppe strips and adopted shorter range patterns when sustained concentration at long range proved impractical. Soviet staffs codified layered riverline defense with small anti-tank packets covering predictable turns, increased the density of mines at culverts and levees, and standardized night demolition drills for bridges to coincide with the attackers' assembly windows. NKPS dispatchers institutionalized bypass loops and blackout procedures at key junctions, and refinery administrations integrated deception, smoke, and dispersal as routine measures rather than temporary expedients. The civilian dimension left measurable traces. Populations in the Kuban and North Caucasus experienced repeated evacuations and returns tied to bridge status and rail capacity. Agricultural cycles in 1942 to 1943 intersected with requisitions and traffic priorities, producing localized shortages that persisted until yard repair and river ferry capacity normalized. Municipal records tracked conversions of schools and warehouses into barracks and hospitals, rotations of refinery and rail personnel, and the reactivation of utilities under air defense constraints. The pattern of municipal recovery, rail first, then hospitals and food depots, later civil freight, mirrored front priorities and illustrates how military logistics structured daily life far from Army headquarters. Historiography has approached the campaign from multiple angles using similar evidentiary standards. Operational studies weigh the timing of directive number 41 and directive number 45 against rail conversion rates, bridge repair cycles, and fuel table assumptions. Economic histories emphasize the link between strategic aims and petroleum arithmetic. Romanian deliveries and synthetic output could not absorb the demands of simultaneous drives to the Volga and the Caucasus, and captured facilities at Maikop did not alter that balance. Soviet accounts integrate evacuation and denial plans into the assessment of combat results, tracing how the removal of critical machines and specialist crews reduced the immediate value of captured sites and accelerated restarts in the rear. Regional studies of the Kuban and North Caucasus document how mixed terrain, steppe, riverine zones, foothills, and ports shaped a sequence of small area battles that aggregated into strategic effects when aligned with broader events at Stalingrad. Memory and commemoration follow regional lines. Sites around Mozdok, Malgobek, and Orjonikidze mark riverline fighting and counterattacks. Novorossiysk preserves port districts and coastal batteries tied to the prolonged urban and littoral struggle. Mountain passes retain traces of road galleries and positions constructed for the Tuapse axis. German unit histories record the ascent of Elbrus on 21 August 1942, and the later withdrawal across the Mainich and the Lower Don as defining episodes for mountain and panzer formations. Soviet and post-Soviet works commemorate evacuation efforts in the oil industry and the role of local labor in keeping rail and road nets functioning under air attack and demolition schedules. Each tradition uses dates, unit designations, and infrastructure landmarks rather than broad characterizations to frame significance. Strategic consequences extended beyond geography. The failure to secure operational fuel in 1942 to 1943 left the Axis coalition dependent on a limited petroleum system that faced increasing interdiction in 1943 to 1944. When air attacks later concentrated on Ploiesti and synthetic plants, reserves shrank faster than frontline demands could be reduced. For the Soviet Union, the retention of Grozny and the restoration of rail links through the North Caucasus supported sustained offensives from the summer of 1943 through 1944, with fuel flows underpinning movements on fronts far from the Caucasus itself. The connection between industrial continuity and military tempo, visible in the summer descent to the Terek, became more explicit as the war progressed. In analytical terms, the 1942 race for oil demonstrates how terrain and distance can convert a plausible strategic aim into a sequence of non-negotiable tasks. Bridges, railheads, fuel cycles, and specialist labor, counted in spans, kilometers, tons per day, and trained crews, set ceilings on what armies could accomplish. The Southern Campaign shows how two coalitions applied similar arithmetic from opposite sides, one to project force across rivers and into foothills to seize energy sources, the other to preserve those sources and deny their immediate use, while buying time for a theater-level counterstroke. The legacy lies in a record that links intentions, decisions, and outcomes through verifiable units of measure rather than through judgments, and in a landscape where river lines, ports, and mountain roads still reveal the choices made when fuel needs met geography.